Hi, everyone. We're well on our way now in our speech class in week 6. I've had a chance to look over some of your tribute speeches. I'm looking forward to taking a look at your persuasive speech outlines. But before you get too deep into those, I know you've been thinking about ideas and topics for those speeches. I'd like to discuss a few things with you this evening um, about delivering your speech and narratives. Some of you have the 2013 textbook, and some of you have the 2015 textbook. If you happen to have the 2015 textbook, it does not have the chapter on narratives, and I have placed in your week 6 update a link to a web page that gives you some very good information about narratives, about telling stories. And there are some links within that page also to some TED Talks um, and some other information that will further enhance your ability to tell stories. Stories are a very important part of speeches and what we do in being able to communicate in a way that people will understand and remember what it is we're trying to say and relate and persuade, if you will, people to our way of thinking. So let me persuade you now to listen up for just a few minutes as I talk a little bit about delivery in speech, narratives, telling a story, and then just the persuasive techniques themselves in persuasion, and maybe give you a few examples. I've had a few emails about what exactly is a persuasive speech or what I expect when I'm listening to your persuasive speeches. It's not anything uh, very difficult in the sense that it is something that we hear probably each and every day, a form of persuasive speech, whether it's a commercial on to buy a particular product, whether it's a debate that's going on about politics, who to vote for, whether it's a new program or something. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. First, in your chapter on delivering your speech, there are some very important things that the textbook writers have given us. I thought it was interesting to note in the introduction, one of the things that was brought out was that a recent top 10 list included people like Michelle Obama, Senator Marco Rubio, and others. And I thought it was particularly interesting that Senator Marco Rubio was one of those listed as one of the top 10 good speakers in the United States, seeing that Senator Marco Rubio is now a leading candidate, a GOP candidate for president. It's interesting that that came up at this time. So if you haven't had an opportunity to listen to Marco Rubio and his speeches, you might. Now, I know that some of you might be thinking, wow, after New Hampshire, I'm not so sure. Well, New Hampshire was interesting. Marco Rubio was accused of going over, and he actually admitted he didn't do so well. He went over maybe his list of talking points. When we further get into our actual list of techniques, you'll understand why maybe telling narratives, telling stories is a little bit better than just listing points when you're actually trying to make a point, which seems a little bit redundant or counterproductive, but it actually isn't. We all probably can remember a time that a parent has tried to teach us a lesson, or um, we've been in maybe a church service even, and the pastor has told a story that has really stuck with us rather than actually being given hard and fast list of 10 things or 5 things that we have sort of remotely or rotely memorized. versus having internalized a story that's taught a lesson, a parable, if you will. Okay, so as far as the types of delivery in speeches, and we've sort of, because of the speed in which we deliver speeches as we go through this term, but we also learn. I know that things have sometimes appeared to be a little hit and miss as, we actually start delivering speeches before we talk about the chapter on delivering speeches. But we come full circle by the time the term ends. So as far as delivering speeches, we've already gone through this a little bit, but manuscript delivery is something that is discussed in this chapter, and that is simply writing your speech out and delivering it that way. The drawbacks, of course, are that you tend to just read from the paper. Not many of you have been entrapped in this sort of thing where you just read from your paper. But for some of you, writing out, manuscripting out your speech is the very best way to make sure that you don't go over or under, to make sure that you can express your ideas most eloquently, whether or not you choose to stick to that manuscript. Sometimes you don't. You'll actually take talking points from your own manuscript and use topics and leads and sentences from your own manuscript, and then choose to focus on those. Memorized delivery then can be something that you do from a manuscript, but it can come off stiff and rote, and you can seem to be distanced from your audience. Oftentimes, if a person is not very experienced and they have memorized their speech and they deliver it to an audience, they forget to wait for things like laughter. They forget to take pauses. So there are very good ways that you can do these appropriate mechanisms, but you have to make sure that you are using them appropriately and aware of your audience as well. Impromptu delivery is one of my favorites. I think that takes just a special kind of confidence and willingness to be able to pull things together. And I'm kind of smiling because usually it's either this week or next week, and I'm probably going to wait until next week. I will give you a little bit of a few minutes of an impromptu speech delivered by a 5-year-old. And it's really quite incredible, and it's something to look forward to for anybody who lacks confidence in delivering a speech. And we'll wait till next week, and I'll give you that so that if you have any nervous ideas about delivering that persuasive speech, I'll let you have at it, and you can see that if a 5-year-old can deliver an impromptu speech, surely you can manage this persuasive speech with not a whole lot of difficulty. The question is, are you passionate enough about your topic? And that's typically what's going to drive you to be able to get through whatever nerves you have and whatever lack of maybe confidence in yourself. And there we go. I lost a light, so I had to turn my monitor back on. Extemporaneous delivery is where you prepare your ideas in advance and you simply use notes to speak. It's one of the most popular and the most used ways that speeches are delivered. To be able to speak extemporaneously is an important way to learn to be able to use your ideas, use your notes, use your research, speak knowledgeably, but not have to be glued to a particular manuscript. It's how most teachers teach. Can you imagine teachers, professors having to prepare actual manuscripted lectures for each preparation, each class they teach? It would be pretty much impossible, almost, and it would be possibly pretty boring for you all. and it wouldn't allow for much change in the culture, much change in what's going on in the world. And so I think that would be a real possibility of why that wouldn't work for a lot of people. Now, one of the delivery things is something that I've been focused on this entire term, and that is to maximize personal appearance, always in a speech, your physical appearance, your clothing, your accessories. That helps you to manage your impressions. It was interesting, and I just remembered I needed to post this column onto our news website. A gentleman wrote a column a few weeks ago on um, public speakers, pastors even, who dress way too casually for his liking, and it created a furor of communication controversy, mostly in his favor, of whether or not pastors should dress more formally. And one of the illustrations that he used was during debates and during funerals. He said, you know, during debates, you never see presidential candidates get up there in t shirts and jeans or even in casual shirts and khakis, but you see them get up there in suits and ties. And he said, you also don't see preachers go to deliver eulogies at funerals in t shirts and khakis or jeans or sweatpants. You see them in their absolute best. You see them in a tie and a suit, comforting the family and delivering the eulogy or the sermon or both. And his point was that if it takes a funeral for a preacher, a pastor to show up in a suit, then that's pretty sad. So, anyway, all that to say that you shouldn't necessarily have to show up in a suit for a speech unless that the audience demands it, that it's an appropriate expression. If you're addressing a bunch of business women, businessmen, that might be the best thing. But always consider your audience, and remember that clothing can create that positive or negative impression. I never forget, I have a good colleague and friend who went to cover, um, he was the head of the Press Photographers Association of America, and went to cover a Hispanic event. And for a couple of years afterwards, I remember that pastors would come up to me. He was a photographer, I was a writer and a photographer. And the pastors, Hispanic pastors, would come up to me and say, "Oh, I hope they don't send that man back." And I'd say, "Oh my goodness," I would mention my friend's name, and I'd say, "Well, why? He's one of the best photographers in the world, really, in the country, definitely." And they simply looked at me just, aghast, and said, "Well, oh, I mean, he wore flip-flops to our meeting, flip-flops and khakis." Now, I mean, you have to understand he's a photographer, and I believe that particular meeting, it was either in Salt Lake City or in New Orleans, and people were dressed pretty casually that were working the newsroom that year because it was hot. But people at that meeting of Hispanic pastors have a lot of dignity, a lot of pride, a lot of definitely are very careful about their appearance. This might be the one time during the year that they get together. They're very professional, very professionally dressed. So they considered it, and somebody very important was visiting that year, and they considered it pretty much of an insult for this photographer to show up in these flip-flops and khakis. So appearance is very important. Now, he wasn't even speaking even. He was just covering the event. But can you imagine a speaker showing up dressed like that for this group? Mm-mm. Even if he was speaking on something casual, like maybe a trip to the Bahamas or some cruise they were trying to advertise, even then I think perhaps the person might have wanted to fit in a little bit more and dress up a little bit more for credibility. just remember, appearance is important. I've seen a little bit of that in this term with some of your speeches. I've seen some interesting head coverings, caps, some, sweatshirts and hoods, and just some interesting items of clothing that might definitely be appropriate for, kind of slinking in last minute to the college classroom and sliding in that desk. But I've often wondered, hmm, is this what you would wear if you were delivering the speech in front of a podium, knowing that your class is made up of all sorts of professional people? Is this what you would choose to be dressed like? Would you take the time to comb your hair? Young women, would you take the time to pat a little bit of powder at least? You might, and you might not. So it all depends on your audience. So that can be very important. Your appearance does matter. Supplementing what you're saying with gestures. You don't see a lot of gestures because this is a tight frame. Normally I would use my hands a lot, and I would walk around the room if I were in a classroom and not a fixed environment. I can use my head to gesture. That is true. And that's typically what I try to do, use my head a little bit more. I one time watched a speech by a deaf woman, and it was absolutely amazing, her presentation, because the nuances that she made while she was speaking, even through an interpreter, were absolutely just incredible. The nuances with the tilt of her head or the blink of her eye was just incredible to watch. But avoiding nervous mannerisms, displaying emotion, making eye contact. Emotion can be good. Too much emotion can be a real damper. So be careful about that. Vary your vocal behaviors. That means speak loudly when you need to and hush when you need to. And work always on clear pronunciation. Probably one of my most humbling moments was when I said vulnerable instead of vulnerable in my college speech class and ended up with a B instead of an A. That was worth an entire letter grade. Vulnerable, not vulnerable. Professor Burt, I'll never forget, got me on that. Can you imagine? An entire letter grade. I'm not that choosy. But be careful. Pronunciation is very important. Pause for effect. That's what I just did. I paused for effect. And we have an added effect, and that is with the video. We can do various things with our videos to actually pause and splice together, so we have a little bit of an advantage. And think critically about your delivery, how you're going to deliver. Stand in front of a mirror ahead of time. They suggest in our textbook to videotape your speech. Well, we don't have that option. It's already being videotaped. The other thing that I told you we'd talk about is telling narratives, always being able to tell a story. Remember the last time I recorded a video, I talked about my mother and the story about my daughter and the crossing, being a crossing guard, and telling the story about my mother and her rainbow socks and being embarrassed and so forth and so on. Maybe some of you remember it. If you do, good, then I did my job. And that was to help you to understand that telling a story is very important. Oftentimes it's how people remember. It's how they can be persuaded. Our chapter on telling narrative starts out with, "I don't see why sleep deprivation is such a big deal. Neither did Brent until one day he found himself in the hospital because of an on-the-job injury." His story goes like this. It's kind of a great little lead, great little introduction. Let me tell you about a variation that we use in writing is once upon a time, and then we just tell the story. So if you have a hard time getting started and you're thinking, what am I going to talk about? In your head, think once upon a time and then just start telling the story. Well, not it's a bad habit of mine. Whitecaps were dancing on the lake at Lake Nasworthy. It was a blustery fall day, and I was excited to be spending time with my, little did I know that he was going to ask me to marry him after only a few weeks. That was 35 years ago. People should really know each other for a lot longer before they get married. Now, see, that could be the beginning of a persuasive speech on how people should take the time to get to know each other before they get married. If I were to say that, I could choose a lot of different topics to use in a persuasive speech or any kind of speech, but typically I'm going to want to, as I told some of you in your feedback on your informative speeches, I'm going to want to tell a story or two and make one of my points or several of my points more interesting, more lasting. You're going to explain something, explain natural phenomena, explain ultimate things. It's interesting, the text says the narratives of the world are numberless. And that's so true. There's stories all around us. There's stories in our life. There's stories that explain our own beliefs, our own attitudes, our own actions, why we do certain things. In news writing, for instance, you can apply this to anything, though, in speech telling, in communication, period. It is always better to show than to tell. This is why I'm trying to give you examples. I'm trying to show you what it is that I mean, not just tell you how to do it, but to show you what the difference is between just delivering a speech with all the bells and whistles or showing you how to do it. And that would be the next part here, is to just talk a little bit about persuasive speeches. And I think it's interesting that, of course, you have to pick your topic first. I've given you a list to look through, but ultimately, the best persuasive speech is something that you're passionate about. Should women be required to sign up for selective service, to register for the selective service in case of a draft in this country? Why or why not? What a topic. It's out there. Immigration is a topic that's out there. Title IX sports, that's one that's been debated often. If there's a topic out there that is currently being debated or that's been debated in the past, my challenge to you is to not to do the Cliff Note thing, and that is to regurgitate and rehash the same old arguments. That was Marco Rubio's problem the other night in New Hampshire. That's why he got called out. because he seemed to give a list of talking points that he's already given in every other place. There was nothing new, and people knew it. That's a bad habit to get into as a student. That's not a good, I mean, as a person in life, there's no fun in that. There's no uniqueness in that. There's no challenge in that. We don't learn by that, just rehashing the same old, same old. So my challenge is to find a new angle, find a new aspect, find something that somebody hasn't looked at. And you think, wow, that's not a cliff note. That's not something that's already been rehashed. That's my challenge to you. Whether it's, and I'm going to take a glance at the list now on my computer that I've attached to your week 6 notes. Do you believe that not wearing a seatbelt should be illegal? Or vice versa, should wearing a seatbelt be required? Should schools sell soft drinks and candies to students in order to raise more money? I saw a good one today. Should football coaches at high schools, public high schools, be paid more than the other teachers? Here's one, great one for Southern California. Do you believe illegal immigrants should be allowed to apply for driver's licenses? Would it be better if the voting age was lowered to 13? That's a bizarre number, but somebody asked that. Should teenagers be allowed to purchase aggressive video games? Interesting. Do you think it would be better if the USA had a universal healthcare system? Oh, there we go. Okay, the Affordable Health Care Act. Do you believe that cities should provide free wireless internet? Okay, well, some cities and airports do. So what do you think of that? And is free really free? Or are taxpayers paying for it? So those are all interesting things, and there's more on that list. But ultimately, find something you're passionate about. That will help drive you. Now, that doesn't mean passion is going to drive your speech. Make a claim, make claims of fact, factual claims about existence, causation, predictions. Do your research. Absolutely do your research. There are a lot of people that accused one of the GOP candidates of not getting his facts right. You don't want to be that. You don't want to be that. Otherwise, we'll have to accuse you of fallacious argumentation. Claims of policy, make sure you get these claims right. Assess your audience's attitude. Remember, don't forget your audience. Don't come up with something so bizarre and so far-fetched that you can't possibly argue. And you basically come in with this belligerent attitude, well, I know you're all going to think I'm a flake, but no, it doesn't mean you can't have a speech that you think is going to be something that people don't agree with. But don't come in with the attitude that you're going to in your face people. Build a bridge. Try to build a bridge. That means find common ground first and then disagree in a disagreeable way. I wanted to talk for a minute. I almost forgot about that. I wanted to talk for a minute about an assignment we had a couple weeks ago about hate speech. A lot of people really got that wrong and really think that hate speech is something that is anything they disagree with, basically, or most things that they disagree with, or things that a lot of people disagree with. Because a lot of people disagree with this, it must be hate speech. Well, hate speech is not necessarily hateful speech. People can say very hateful things. I don't like you because you are a nymphomaniac. I don't like such and such type of ethnicity because I think they are dishonest and they are trying to get too much out of our system. And so I think we should build a wall and keep those people out of our country. Is that hate speech? It may sound hateful, but hate speech means that you are inciting people to violence, or you are going to commit violence. Your words are threatening and violent in nature. It doesn't simply mean that it is hateful to the listener, that it is perceived as being hateful. It means it is hate speech, which is a crime. It's violent, and it incites people to violence. There's not just a simple causation. Well, that person said that erroneously that these people commit crimes, and so now somebody might go beat them up because they think they're going to commit a crime, and it's not even true, and so that person should be accused of hate speech because they got these people riled up. No, 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 no. Wait a minute. It has to be speech that says basically you should go beat them out of because these people are okay, and it's because of their color or their orientation or their this or their that, and we're going to get them, and that's hate speech. There's sometimes a little bit of a gray area, but not too much. So, while I don't endorse hate speech or hateful speech, and I think it's inappropriate, it doesn't mean that hateful speech is not protected under the First Amendment. So we have to be very careful in understanding that. Now, the good thing is, if you are good in speech, you can take hateful speech and turn it right on its head by using reasonable, well thought out, passionate speech that puts that hateful, usually inappropriate, inaccurate speech right out the door and show the listeners where it's wrong, simply wrong. And that's where you get your best revenge. Instead of yelling, hate speech, shut that person up. No, we want a good healthy First Amendment in this country because we want to be able to say what we need to say when we need to say it. Because the minute you start shutting somebody up over here, somebody else is going to shut you up over there. So we need to be very careful not to want to shut people up because we don't agree with their opinions. So, okay. So assess your audience's attitude. Choose a specific purpose. Be convincing about policies and reasoned action. Most of all, be willing to persuade people to action. That's the entire goal. Understand that a persuasive speech is just that. You're trying to persuade somebody to do something, or persuade a group to do something, to sign a letter, to vote a certain way, to campaign a certain way, to build a bridge, to be more generous. You're ultimately trying to persuade people to do something, to be on your side. And so you need to employ whatever sequence of speech patterns, whatever storytelling techniques, whatever facts are in your favor that you can use. So do all of that. Put a good outline together. I'll look at it and we will proceed from there. There are some, I want to bring your attention to the Come Watch Lacrosse speech in your book. There's an example there about lacrosse, and it starts out, have you ever sat and watched a long, boring baseball game? Well, there's a narrative right in the beginning. And then needed, a grief support system on campus. That's a very practical, college appropriate speech. And again, it's a narrative. It starts out with a narrative. The phone rings, you answer it, and suddenly the world stops. So you have your hook, you have your narrative right in the beginning of a persuasive speech. Let me just say that very rarely do statistics work unless they're absolutely mind-blowing statistics. And statistics work better on some segments of society than others. But typically, storytelling is going to be what gets people. So with that, my mind-blowing statistic for the evening is that my newest grandchildren are a little bit over a week old. And Claire and Clark are tucked in. And they were born February 1st. And Clark was 6.6 pounds. Claire was 4.7 pounds. Well, 4 pounds, 7 ounces. Clark was 6.6 pounds, 6 ounces. And they're doing well. And with that, I leave you. Have a great week and weekend, and I'll be looking forward to seeing your work.